Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And we're talking about trails again today. And I just wanted to add a small rant. It is that sugar, too much sugar kills. So be very wary of it. The data that's coming up is increasingly saying less sugar. Okay, that's my rant for today.
Wait. I can even jump in here. I had never really thought very much about what you just said, but there is actually, if you go on YouTube, of course, you can find huge amounts of stuff that has, you can't even rely on. But a researcher at, I believe, Berkeley gave a talk exactly in what you just said. Americans have decided that fat is what's evil. And so people who make processed foods they now trumpet that their products don't have much fat in them. The problem is fat tastes so good. Think about it. If you're ever at a carnival or a county fair or whatever, what smells the best? When you get near where they've dipped stuff in fat. And now we're told, oh, that's bad for you. So, to be healthier for you, we're going to leave all the fat or much of the fat out of our products. Well, what's going to make them taste decent to you if there's very little fat in it? And the answer is they dump lots and lots of sugar into it. Okay, on the surface, well, fine. Sugar tastes good too. The problem is your body takes in all of that sugar and immediately, guess what it does? Turns it into fat. And so that's what's happening is and it's actually even worse for you. I mean, and go to YouTube, watch the Berkeley professor. He'll explain it all. But there's the minute-and-a-half version of it is when you eat anything processed, you're getting huge amounts of sugar, which is just as bad for you as the fat that's no longer in that processed food. So I guess maybe the bottom line is make the food yourself. If you're the one who puts it on the stove, you can control how much fat, what kind of fat do you use, extra virgin olive oil or even just plain old corn oil or whatever, and you actually are the one. And if there's going to be sugar or salt in it, you adjust the amount that goes in there. And even if you like both sugar and salt, if you know that they're not particularly good for you, you put less of them in. It makes things taste a little bit different, but it's also way less bad for you. We should also point out the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and nobody else. So that's it. Just the elongated version. Why is sugar bad for you? Because your body's going to just turn it into fat, and we all know fat is not one of the best things you can put into your person.
Well, on the other hand, fat includes the fat-soluble tastes and flavors that you like, and there's another form of research which says that a certain amount of fat is actually good. It's all things in moderation, and the problem with sugar is that it's not in moderation. The drinks especially are 1 liter bottle with a huge amount of sugar in it, and that's not good for anyone's soul.
I've mentioned this man's name before. Michael Pollan is a food writer, Pollan, I think maybe how he spells his name. And he said exactly what you just said. In fact, I think the cover of one of his books is, everything in moderation. Eat more vegetables, especially dark green leafy ones. But yeah, the problem isn't any one species of food, carbohydrates or proteins or fat or whatever. It's the fact that, people in America just think, oh, that one is completely wrong, leave it completely out. No, you can't do that. Just cut down on all of the ones except the ones that are the highest in nutrients. Like, again, vegetables and fruits of all sorts. That should be at the top of people's personal food pyramid.
And people who produce produce that you're talking about have a problem in winter, and it's interesting to see that those producers are now moving towards greenhouses so that you can have kale and other things during the winter, and you don't have to import them from Brazil or other places. It's okay to import, but it also costs a lot in transportation, and the cost in transportation is the energy that's used to move the ships and planes and trucks that move that material. Well, this week was exciting for the Kickapoo Trail. The Forest Preserve was faced with bids for construction on the first phase of construction of the 25-mile trail from Urbana to Danville. And the bids came in about $400,000 higher than expected. So the question was, at a Forest Preserve meeting, which was held within the at the Phillips Building, which is an Urbana Park District building, mainly because most of the population is in Champaign, and in wintertime it's always difficult to get to Mahomet, to the facilities they have there where they usually meet. So I was pleased to see that the board was younger than I had expected, and they had to face the decision whether to deny these bids and replan the trail, like make it more narrow. It's 10 feet wide with 2 feet on either side of that of gravel. That's more than enough for two mountain bicycles to pass. The Forest Preserve has already asked questions about this of the planners, who are probably state planners, and more formal and one trail fits all syndrome. This is going through the country. The Forest Preserve had actually asked if the trail could not be narrower further out, and it wasn't easy to change plans. Once plans are made, they're sometimes set in concrete and difficult to change. So the plan comes to us as a fait accompli. So there was a study session which involved the discussion of this. I spoke at that. I want to remind people that we took out this project about 20 years ago, but if you go back another 20 years, it took us that time to sort of assess the resource that is Kickapoo State Park, the mining lakes that have resulted there, the studies that come from Shelford and Kendi and other researchers who want to point out that some of the mining has resulted in ponds that may be 75 years old or 100 years old, and they watch carefully the biodiversity growing in those ponds. We have the opportunity to talk about gob piles, where mines will remove overburden and bring it out, and often those gob piles are interestingly orange and yellow because of the sulfur that's in the coal that's underneath in Carboniferous age beds of vegetation that were entrapped by fault lines that trapped moisture and resulted in a vegetation that has been converted to coal and which we use. So there's also interesting ethnology. Where did the people come from who looked after the pit ponies that mined the coal? Well, they came upstream from Kentucky and other places like this. What happened to them when strip mining came and you didn't need pit ponies anymore, and the agriculture to make the hay that fed the animals in the mines? So you have a different balance of people and their backgrounds in the Danville area. There's Vermilion County has rivers that come from Ford County down through and then eventually into the Wabash. So it makes it an interesting county, and this trail runs right into it. It doesn't exactly go into Danville because the railroad bed that it's on, which was Conrail at the time of abandonment, was retained by CSX, which bought the active railroad line, and that occupies the corridor where we would go straight into Danville. So, but the trail drops into Kickapoo State Park, and we're very pleased about that. It will be developed in stages, and there will be costs. So the study session looked at some of these questions, and the dilemma is that if you turn the plan back for revision, then that's going to take another year. The trail's already sat around for 25 years, and during that time you have land invasion and a whole bunch of questions that come up. And besides, the speakers were attuned to saying that we've been at this for a long time, and there are skeptics who are not sure that it's ever going to happen. And it does look like it's going to happen now. So the people who are supportive may give something modest. In fact, there was a fundraising effort on the way to the meeting during Thursday, the daytime, that call-ins were from especially bikers to set forth some funds that would encourage the Forest Preserve to not send the plan back to tours. So there were fundraisers who were saying that we've been at this, we have supporters. It will disappoint them if there's not some instant gratification, and instant gratification means putting in a section of the trail that can be used. It will be from about where Walmart is in Urbana and going east to St. Joe, one bridge included. The cost of $3 million is kind of high because rail trails are unique in the fact that they are very low cost trails. There's a railroad bed there. Once the tracks and the ties are taken out, you can ride a bicycle without too much bother. So it's been a little intriguing to see that the budget was in the vicinity of $3 million, and then it was overbid by about $400,000. But the promoters were wanting to say, let's go with it, we'll get you the extra $400,000. And eventually the Forest Preserve had a formal meeting, and it did regular business, but one of the main businesses was the acceptance of the lowest bid, which still is in the vicinity of $3 million. So that went down for accolades, and it's good for those of us who have been involved in initiation of this sort of thing, because it substantiates that element of approval that says this is going to happen. And that means that we can then transfer our interests to other trails and other sites and other prairies and other ethnological interests between Decatur and Danville and Clinton in a triangle that brings to Champaign especially terrains and interests that we don't have in Champaign County. For instance, DeWitt County has Clinton Lake, but it also has a river system that is fed by a moraine that is interesting, rolling. Hart County has Allerton Park and also the Sangamon River and terrain and interest and biodiversity. And Vermilion County has a lot of interesting terrain. It has a history of Indian people moving west to grow crops and to hunt, and then retreat in the wintertime to Danville. So this is very positive, and now we want to see the rest of it get looked at. So we're talking to you, and we're wondering what the next thing is. And I left that meeting just a little bit different, because we'd, as Heartland Pathways, had made the applications that make this trail possible. But when the trail gets implemented, invariably the money that comes in goes to the development of the trail. It doesn't go to the cost of doing business, of initiating. So if we have to think about Decatur or Clinton or other sites that are interesting around Monticello, and the possibility of historic rails coming into Champaign, then we have to be funded to make those innovative moves, and some of them are very, very positive. So I leave, and this mingle of people after the adjournment of the meeting. People were mingling to discuss fundraising, and awards had been made for people who have worked with trails. Davis from the Champaign Bikes has done a lot to raise money through the sale of bikes that have been donated, and so a lot of things were on people's minds. I just left because a lot of the initial costs were ours. We had to do 20 years of thinking to see whether this was an appropriate corridor to take out an interim trail use agreement on. And if we're going to go forward, we need to continue that. It's not just one thing and it's done and that's it. We're constantly thinking about what is the future and what we'll hand on to other generations and what their future will be. So I walked out, and I walked around Lincoln Square for a while, listened to people who were playing music informally, about probably 10 or so people enjoying themselves, and other people were enjoying them. I went into the co-op, and then I went and inspected the photo show, which probably will be in, I didn't bring a brochure, but I think it's still intact. Today, I think it goes to a little while longer, but it's a very nice show. So I was thinking and dreaming. My next dream is, where will the trail start and how will it start? So I went over, we've done this a little bit before, but not in detail. This is going to be a huge trail. It's almost a highway, adjacent to a highway, which is, I had to say, can we have some change orders and narrow the trail a little bit and reduce this tremendous cost? So we're looking at a trail that starts at Route 130 or thereabouts. And I'm very aware that there's a little section between there and Main Street, Urbana, which is has been one of our local restorations prairie remnants, and a botanist would go to this site invariably to allow students to get an idea of what a remnant prairie was like. The area has been summarily invaded by road widenings and other activities there. Then some of the business of Banner has gone out there. The site we're talking about is exactly opposite Aldi's, and it's on the north side of the road when the trail is on the south side of the road. So you have to think about where your trail headquarters is, how you get to it, how you perhaps could encourage industries that might be pro bicycling. I wandered around for at least an hour just trying to figure out how Aldi's would fit into this. There are nice trails around Aldi's. There are public trails. There are the planning for the Commons area, which is a developed area behind there. And I kept walking and walking and walking, and I see this community is very much almost a gated community with a lot of fairly affluent houses. And there's a fence which is probably about 8 or 10 feet, 12 feet tall, that's very blank. You look at this fence that goes between the development and Aldi's, and it strikes you with white and a reflection. And I'm thinking that, wow, that wall could be nicely painted with the prairie plants we don't know about. And so you could have some repetition, some softening of that blank white. And so there's a lake behind, and this is a rather private subdevelopment. And so it wants to be private, but it's next to a big vacant lot. Could you think about something like a bicycle event on the corner? Would that relate to clothing, like the clothing that goes with athletic events, bicycling events? Could there be a sale of bicycles? This is, after all, a relatively affluent area, and the bicycle corridor is a fairly affluent trail. We know that. If you go through Indianapolis with a trail and you put cameras on it to see who uses it, it's mostly fairly well-to-do people. The low-income people on either side are adapted to using bicycles with the facilities they have. They make do. And but they don't have the bicycles and the atmosphere that allows them to go through Indianapolis and make use of such trails. Now, that's not always the case. You can actually educate people to use trails and to have outlets at places where they can communicate in their own way. So when we're thinking about a trail headquarters, we're thinking about how does this trail morph into taking a trail through behind the hospitals into Champaign and through Champaign to Bonneville and Seymour and to Monticello and down to Shady Rest across Madden Creek and up to Lodge and through to DeLand Weldon Lane and to the Weldon Spring State Park, which is right near Clinton Lake, which is one of those resources we don't have in Champaign. If we go back to Whiteheath, we go down by the Railroad Museum and across the Sangamon and past Allerton Park, where there are trail opportunities, and then take an old Route 47 into Decatur, where there's also a lot of bicycle activities. We're beginning to dream. Dave has a thought, I think.
No, I was just gesturing to the person. We've got somebody outside. The previous host is out there, and he and I are gesturing at each other because some odd things have been happening with the telephone.
Okay.
So pardon me, as you were, go back to it, talking about trails. Trails are going to be very good. I'm looking forward to this trail, even though it means having to find another bicycle because 23-millimeter wide tires just are not going to do it on crushed limestone.
No. So I'm still looking at the oldies area, the prairie that I'm wanting to see established or recreated across the road is exactly opposite the oldies. So I went to the oldies manager to ask if this is a possibility. Does the overall administration of oldies have an interest in promoting themselves with this sort of interest? And I think it was a new thought, but I see a lot of fairly well-heeled people using oldies. There's an opportunity there. You can buy things at a lower price, and you can modify them as you wish, and that includes a lot of the things that David was talking about already. So I'm out there again after having talked to the manager, and I'm thinking of the Commons area and where the administration is there. So I walked around the lake and I took photographs, and at one stage I looked at all these houses, and they have 1, 2, or 3 car garages, and all those garages look onto the street. It's very strange to see a whole row of houses with garages. It's an aesthetic which is very different from what you expect of architects that are going to give you a house front. Life has changed, so we're very oriented to a car. And if you go out into the boondocks, into the country, you'll find that the front porch, which was where the horse and cart would pull up and you'd go into the house, has been replaced by a driveway around the backside of the house. So the real entrance now is the backside of the house. So this is something of what I was looking at. I was looking at plants that are tall grasses that don't belong to East Central Illinois. They're not native. And I'm thinking if I have someone to put prairie plant pictures on that very, very white wall, could we have some plants? Could we have a compass plant? Could we have pollinators? How could we work with the commons to, it's called Beringer Commons, and we'll put up some satellite pictures so that you understand what we're talking about. If you go north from Beringer Commons, you go up and over Route 74, and then on the other side of that is Phillips Track and Treeley's Woods and Brownfield Woods. So you're talking about a glaciated Urbana moraine which extends to Rantoul. How do all these things integrate? And it's gone round in my head, and I want you to be interested enough to go out there and look at the site and think what you could do with it. It extends to Main Street, but the railroad bed extends beyond Main Street. So I take a walk around Main Street of East Urbana. Main Street has a bicycle track along the side, but it goes only so far, and then the bicycle opportunity narrows because the road narrows. And I would think that it would be much more interesting to have bicycles on the old railroad bed with a few trees and some prairie, and come off with a road that would go on to Main Street. I think it's called Smith Road. It's just a little section that allows people to move from 150 to Main Street. But then I would like to extend that rail bed through the railroad yards. I'm interested in seeing the railroad yards retained, because railroad business is so much more efficient than to put the similar products on to the road. For example, Solo Cup is just nearby, and it can take in 4 railroad cars of plastic during summertime when there's a need for plastic cups. Not that I'm encouraging plastic cups. I would rather encourage a paper cup that can be recycled. But even so, 4 railroad cars would have to be replaced by 13 semi-trailers to bring the same materials. So I'm interested in the railroad staying afloat, but I'm interested in how we get through that yards, and you get to come out of the yards to the west, just near the station theatre. And near the station theatre there has been a reworking of the Boneyard Creek there, and a nice little array of bicycle ways that are interesting. And then you have to go through the hospitals, and there we have a problem at Lincoln Avenue. How do you put bicycles across Lincoln Avenue, where University Avenue are 2 very high-pressure streets? So I have yet to walk that area and try and figure out how you could get bicycles across Lincoln Avenue without people getting killed. Then we go behind Pravina Covenant Hospital there, and you're now in the North End, and how do we interface with the North End? And so I'm encouraging you folk out there to do a little walking too, and I think the only way these things happen is that somebody gets together with a cup of coffee and a bagel and 2 people in the basement and a few sketches, and gradually the idea happens. This trail wouldn't be if we hadn't dreamed about its possibility. So I'm encouraging you to think that way, to walk around all these and to see how you could convince them that this was something that they might support in a small grant, or even encourage without a cost. And I would like you to ride your bicycle around Phillips Track and Treeley's Woods and Brownfield Woods and see how we relate. Could those woods be open at some stage and be available? Could the Commons actually, how could it handle a proposal of this manner? I have a feeling that the Commons was hoping to develop more than it has. So what would this do to encourage their interests? And how does this fit into Urbana? You can come down Main Street past an interesting reconstruction prairie. It's not only reconstruction prairie, it has a little low spot where there's a forest that was part of a development post-glaciation area where there are trees in a low spot, and that's kind of natural. So this reconstruction has morphed into something more. The people who have done that, the Banner Park District and their associates, have actually made the walkway on the roadside waddle through and curl a little bit so that there's prairie on the roadside. So you can go into Urbana on a trail, but you can also go through the railroad to the north and through Urbana, and then how do we look at coming into St. Joe at the other end? There's a huge meander, and the housing of St. Joe sits perhaps 8 or 10 feet above the old meander. What happens when you want to get water off of your fields so that you can grow crops on the glacial terrain that was very swampy? Then you take that big loop meander and you cut through it and let the water come out faster. It causes a little more erosion because it takes time for that water to move around the meander. But what is left is a bottomland that is damp, and it has been taken over by the Forest Preserve as a development that planted trees. There's even a nice little parking lot there. So I encourage you to go to the St. Joe end. BJ, the mayor of St. Joe, who owns a hairdressing operation there, where his hairdressing, I'm sure, is associated with conversation with people. And so how do we end up in St. Joe? Do we follow the old interurban in, or do we follow the main line in? Does Casey's want to buy part of the line? Do we sell part of the line to developers? But perhaps no, we might need that open space. On the east side of Urbana, which is of St. Joe, which is not in this particular phase one, is opposite development, and huge amounts of development on the north side of 150 have caused that corridor of prairie, very good prairie and prairie soil, to be mown to the extent that it probably doesn't exist anymore. The nth degree of this is to have mown and also to have herbicided to get rid of all the broadleaves. So then you have to think about an S-shaped curved bridge going up and over Union Pacific. And then I want to have you to dream and just wandering around and finding the resources to go past Pioneer Grain and to figure that that's an organization which takes in hybrid grain that has to be seed for the next year's crop. And there's a whole interest there, apart from the prairie that's outside it. What about the drainage commissioners, and how do we put drains under the trail, and how do we work with the farmers that are desperate to get water off their fields? How do you stand on the bridge that's there and look at the cutoff and look to see what fish are underneath? How do we deal with a flood that brings trees down and hits the pillars that support the bridge? How do we discourage anyone from putting their picnic fire on the bridge and perhaps distorting the steel? How do we encourage people to think about this to the point where they realize that it's public property and publicly owned, and they have a stake in checking out the young people who might use it or the older people who might walk it? How do we get together on this? It all starts with individuals dreaming, and we want to encourage you to dream, to think about the towns to the south, like Homer. We want you to think about Mr. Fithian, Dr. Fithian, who had a lot of land in that area. He never lived in Fithian, which was sort of named after him by the railroad companies, which often name the stations according to people who have had a role to play. But Dr. Fithian mainly operated out of Danville. His son was a Fithian native, and he actually farmed some of the 1,000-odd acres that Dr. Fithian owned. So we pick up little history books. You get to know the people and the people who settled the area early on, and go back to the Indians who used to know that there was salt there. And so salt and sugar were both used as preservative, because if you sit a solution of salt around a bacterium, it takes by exosmosis, it takes the water out of the bacterium, and the bacterium dies. So these things were used for preservation as well as for flavor. So there on the corner at Bucktown, there was a kettle, because the Indians let the settlers know where there was salt, and then the salt was taken over by the settlers, which is a not unusual way of colonially looking at resources. It's sort of manifest destiny that if you are not using the resource to its full capacity, then you have the godly right to take it over and do better. It's something that you expect in a colonial era, because that's how people thought, and that's how our developmental thinking was. But to see that sort of thing happen these days is not so good. And we watch that when it goes to land invasion. We have some people who think that our weeds and seeds are not the highest and best use, so they can invade. So you have to think about that. You have to think about the bridges and the fairgrounds, fairgrounds are actually owned by the Kickapoo State Park. And go to the Kickapoo State Park. And it's been a controversial area underneath that big bridge there, because the people on motorcycles have found strip mines very interesting challenges, and so they can be all over the place. So at some stage, those people have been denied their challenges. It includes bicycles that want that same challenge. So how do we leave a balance of that sort of physical activity along with the nature that these people are riding with? We might have to think of trails that are one-way, that allow a bicycle to go through on a 2-foot trail or a 3-foot trail, because they don't have to pass anyone else, and that's a possibility. So I'm encouraging you to get out there and think and dream. If you go past Fool's Elevator, think about how you might learn about how the harvest comes in. Is this a dangerous place for neophytes to be roaming around? Do we fence it off? Or do we interpret it? There's a cemetery at Mayview that has a lot of history. It's on a little morainic knoll, and so you can wander around and you can look at the funereal art and decide what era this person was in and how many children did they have. Sometimes they had a lot of children, because children were needed to run the farm, to do things. That then, when you had a large family, in early times, you might have lost a lot of those children to disease or other things where there was not the medicine to preserve them. But then as you get up into the late Victorian era, those large families remained around, and there's a population increase. So think about that, and then think about how many people have children today, and how long does it take, and how can women especially have a job and have children and do things. We have tremendous resources these days that are available to us that allow us to not have to spend a lifetime supervising children. And we have to think about how those children handled a mother and a father that are both working and doing interesting things. So as you go out there, take a slow trip in your car. Watch behind, because it's a fairly fast road. But meander along and think about the trail, which is the road came after the railroad line, so you're going parallel, and it is a busy road, but think and dream.
Here's a question for you. It just occurred to me, a really good way to look at something and think about how this could become something, like talking about this becoming a trail, is to go someplace where there already is a trail and see how it's been done in other places. The nearest trail that I can think of is if you go out to Lake of the Woods, except I love that trail, and it's paved, it's asphalt. How far do you have to go from where we are right now to find a trail like what's going to go in here that's got crushed limestone? I mean, you don't have to go all the way to the Katy Trail, right? There must be something closer than that.
We do have local trails on
Where?
Route 45 and Lake Park, and Meadowbrook Park, that are reconstruction sites or preservation sites on Windsor Road between First Street and Neal Street. There's a little prairie, so you can get snippets of prairie around town. But then you can go further out of town. Monticello has an excellent 2-mile of rail trail. Going from the west side, it goes along an embankment, which in itself is interesting. Then it goes over a truss bridge, and you can stand there and see the Sangamon River. And you can see the polders where people would farm on either side and pump out the water so that they could farm. And they don't do that anymore, but the elements are still there. And what was a farm can now be a frog pond, and you can take your tape recorder and record those creatures having a wonderful time. And then you could go over County Farm Road and up on an extension of that trail. And we hope that trail will extend again with a nature trail from the west side of the Sangamon River all through Allerton Park, where we have creatures that are on the verge of endangerment. There's a Massasoit rattlesnake that has been there, and that has encouraged Allerton Park to put in a mile by 66 feet adjacent to our railroad right-of-way prairies, so that we might encourage those endangered rattlesnakes. But along with the rattlesnakes come a whole bunch of other things. That might be 2,000 different types of insects, some of them almost microscopic. So you take a lens with you, hang it around your neck, and see that little wasp that's pollinating for you. So you have to talk to the people who are mowing, and so there are state dictates about mowing, and mowing is a neatness thing that you have to know that if the road's not mowing, then that is not neat and tidy and interesting. But in actual fact, it takes out the the plants before they've even had a chance to express themselves. So how do we educate people about that sort of thing? And one of the things that I think is important for us to do is to introduce you to different species so that you get to know what a prairie is. The flowers are small, they're exciting, but they come for a short time often. When you're a horticulturist and you want a flower for your garden, you take that plant and you genetically breed it so that it flowers for a longer period of time. Like we have coneflowers that flower all summer, and they're branched and strong, and they have petals that are very dramatic. But the wimpy coneflower on the side of the road is what we're looking at. And so how do you get to know what your heritage ecosystem is? So I'm going to spend just a few minutes on 2 or 3 species. We talked about a few last week. One of the things that is interesting, in our little pocket prairie across the road, we have monad, or a balm for bees. It's called bee balm, B-A-L-M. And sometimes I can see 100 bumblebees working that flower, which is like a salvia. It's wonderful, and it has been bred for different colors and for garden use. We don't have the garden one, we have the prairie one, but it hangs out over the road, and it's interesting. And we'll show you a few pictures of that. We have a culver's root over in the little prairie. A culver's root, usually out in the field, is in a damp place, but it comes up with leaves that are interesting, and then there's in the middle of summer, up comes a candelabra of an inflorescence. And so we do have photographs that you can see of how that inflorescence changes and gets more dramatic. Then the seeds come on, and then we collect the seeds. But sometimes we leave the seeds because the whole inflorescence in itself is interesting as it ages. We look at yellow coneflower. Right on the corner, opposite left, there are plants of yellow coneflower. They're a diplomat. If we're planting a reconstruction prairie, we use yellow coneflower a lot because it takes about 4 years, but by the time it gets to be 4 years old, that prairie is alive with yellow. Wow. Where did all these plants come from? And then gradually the other prairie plants that we've planted start to come, and the yellow coneflower drops back to being a plant here and there. And so we know the ecosystem well enough to be able to simulate it as best we can. This is not easy to guesstimate what is. We're tempted to use the plants that grow very quickly. The grasses grow well and they grow quickly, and they can dominate to the point that they deny the broadleafs their activity. The broadleafs are slow to grow. We know the few diplomats, but it's interesting to watch that sort of ecosystem. You can learn a lot by going to another country, to another place, to another trail to visit. But you could also learn a lot by watching your own backyard, just the way it reacts to light and shade, and we encourage that. If there's a ditch that runs through your place, there's there's moisture, and so there's a wetland, and we enjoy having that opportunity for you to see cordgrass, which often grows in damp places, and if you grow it from seed, it takes 10 years for the seed to grow. If you take a shovel and take some of the clones of cordgrass, it grows immediately, and you have to watch that you don't destroy your little wetland by having too much cordgrass. Some of these plants are prairie plants, but they can take over if you're not careful. We also have invasive weeds that are either farm weeds or they're farm plants that come in, like yellow sweet clover is a plant that it was used extensively for hay, and it's known as a legume that can take nitrogen out of the air, and gradually that gets into the soil and it gets utilized in a different way. It's sort of a natural fertilizer. It has rhizobia on its bacteria, symbiotic bacteria on its roots, and so it's often not only used in haymaking, but it's used on roadsides as a natural fertilizer. But for us, it is a very invasive plant, and it takes over and can compete out the plants we want. So that's probably getting to be the, yes, it's 1 minute too, so we have to say thank you for listening. Go out to the Kickapoo Trails, see what you can find out, enjoy this warmth, and this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial, and
Dave on the
the
board.
21st of February. And so we can track the CD, and we go up on YouTube, and you can find us there, and we're with the help of the Barron Public Television. Thanks for listening, and Dave on the board.
Dave on the board as always, yes. And the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.